A makeshift basketball court in Tondo, Manila, fell silent except for the rhythmic bounce of a worn leather ball against cracked asphalt. An American talent scout stood courtside, arms crossed, watching barefoot Filipino players run through their pickup game with a smirk that said everything about what he thought of what he was seeing. He had flown from Los Angeles to scout prospects for a developmental league, expecting to find raw talent that could be polished into something usable. What he found instead would challenge every assumption he'd built over 15 years evaluating basketball players across 3 continents. The American was Marcus Chen, a 38-year-old scout who'd worked for 2 NBA franchises and currently evaluated international talent for a sports agency that placed players in developmental leagues worldwide. Marcus had seen it all, from AAU tournaments in Atlanta to European youth leagues in Barcelona, from Chinese basketball academies to Australian development programs. His eye for talent had helped discover 3 players who eventually made NBA rosters, and his reputation for identifying potential before others saw it had made him valuable in the competitive world of basketball scouting. He approached every evaluation with the same criteria: measurable athleticism, fundamental skills, basketball IQ, and the physical tools that translated to higher levels of competition. Marcus arrived in Manila following a tip from a colleague who mentioned that Filipino street basketball produced surprisingly skilled players given the lack of resources and formal training infrastructure. The colleague suggested Marcus might find hidden gems, players with raw talent who could be developed if given proper coaching and conditioning. Marcus was skeptical but curious enough to investigate. He had seen poverty and passion for basketball in other countries, but he approached the Philippines with the clinical detachment of someone who evaluated talent against objective standards developed in American basketball culture. He expected to see enthusiasm, but doubted he would find players who could actually compete at professional levels. His first stop was a street court in Tondo, one of Manila's most densely populated and economically challenged neighborhoods. The asphalt was cracked and uneven, the rim hung slightly crooked on a makeshift backboard, and the lines marking the court were faded almost to invisibility. There were no bleachers, no scoreboard, no water coolers or benches, just a concrete playing surface surrounded by cramped houses, with neighbors watching from windows and kids sitting on the edges hoping to get into the next game. Marcus pulled out his notebook, more out of habit than expectation, and prepared to observe. What struck him immediately was how short the players were. In American basketball culture, height was considered almost essential for serious play, with guards typically standing at least 6 feet tall and forwards and centers ranging from 6'6" to 7 feet. The Filipino players on this Tondo court ranged from about 5'4" to 5'9", with one player who might have been 5'11" serving as their tallest and playing what Americans would call the center position. Marcus's initial assessment, based purely on physical measurements, was that these players lacked the fundamental physical tools necessary for competitive basketball at any professional level. He made notes about their height disadvantage and wondered how much time he should invest watching before moving on. Then the game started, and Marcus's assumptions began to crack. The Filipino players moved with a speed and fluidity that surprised him. Their ball handling was exceptional, with crossovers and behind-the-back dribbles executed at full speed on the uneven surface. They passed with creativity and precision, threading balls through tight spaces, executing no-look passes that found cutting teammates, playing with a chemistry that suggested they had been playing together for years. Their shooting mechanics, while not textbook by American standards, were effective, with players draining long 3-point shots despite the crooked rim and inconsistent bounce of the worn ball on cracked asphalt.
What really caught Marcus's attention was their court awareness and basketball intelligence.
Despite having no formal coaching visible, these street players understood spacing, recognized defensive rotations, and made reads that Marcus typically saw only in players who had been through organized basketball systems. They played with a pace and creativity that reminded him of elite point guards, constantly probing defenses, creating advantages through misdirection and change of pace. One player in particular, a kid who looked barely 20 years old and stood maybe 5'6", controlled the game with a confidence and skill that made Marcus lean forward and start taking detailed notes. The kid's name was Thirdy, and he played with the kind of instinctive genius that cannot be taught in formal training programs. He had a handle that allowed him to navigate through defenders in phone booth-tight spaces, a court vision that let him find open teammates before they even cut, and a fearlessness about attacking the basket despite being surrounded by players taller than him. Thirdy played barefoot, his feet calloused and tough from years on hot asphalt, and he moved with a balance and quickness that expensive basketball shoes could not have improved. When he drove to the basket, he contorted his body mid-air to avoid shot blockers, finishing with creative layups and floaters that drew appreciative shouts from the watching crowd. Marcus found himself mentally comparing Thirdy to NBA players, something he rarely did when watching international prospects. The kid's ability to change speeds reminded Marcus of a young Tony Parker. His willingness to attack bigger defenders echoed Allen Iverson's fearlessness, and his passing vision suggested the court awareness of a player who truly understood the game at its deepest levels. But Marcus's training and professional skepticism immediately pushed back against this comparison. How could a barefoot kid on a street court in one of Manila's poorest neighborhoods actually possess skills comparable to NBA talent? The absence of formal training, the lack of proper facilities, the physical size disadvantage, all of these factors suggested that what Marcus was seeing must be an illusion, good street ball that would fall apart against real competition. During a break between games, Marcus approached the court with his translator, a Filipino-American colleague who had arranged this scouting trip. He asked if he could speak with some of the players, particularly Thirdy. The young Filipino player was friendly but cautious, clearly not understanding why an American scout would be interested in a street game. Through the translator, Marcus learned that Thirdy had been playing basketball since he was 6 years old, that he played pickup games almost every day, that he had never had a formal coach or been part of an organized team, and that he had learned everything by watching NBA games on borrowed phones and practicing alone on this court for hours after everyone else went home. Marcus asked if Thirdy had ever considered playing professionally. The young Filipino laughed and gestured at his surroundings, explaining through the translator that professional basketball was for people with money for training, people with connections, people who went to the right schools. Street players like him played for the love of the game and the respect of their community, but they did not dream of playing professionally because that world was closed to them. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a mixture of recognition and discomfort. Here was genuine talent being wasted because of circumstances beyond the player's control, potential that would never be developed because the systems that identified and cultivated basketball talent did not reach into places like this. Then Marcus made a decision that surprised himself. He challenged the street players to a game against some players from a local college team he had been scheduled to scout later that week. He called his contacts, arranged for the college team to come to the street court the next day, and told Thirdy and his teammates that he wanted to see how they performed against players who had formal training and coaching. The street players accepted immediately, excited by the challenge and the chance to prove themselves against competitors they normally never encountered. The next day, Marcus arrived at the Tondo court to find it packed with spectators. Word had spread about the challenge match, and the neighborhood had turned out to watch their street players take on college ballers. The college team arrived in matching jerseys and basketball shoes, warming up with structured drills that showed their formal training. They were taller, more athletic-looking, and carried themselves with the confidence of players who belonged to an organized system.
Marcus set up his camera to record the game, partly for his scouting records, and partly because he suspected something interesting was about to happen.
The game was not close. The street players, led by Thirdy, dominated from the opening possession. Their superior ball handling allowed them to break the college team's defensive pressure. Their court awareness let them exploit every defensive mistake, and their conditioning from playing on rough asphalt in tropical heat gave them an endurance advantage that became more pronounced as the game went on. Thirdy personally scored 28 points, including 5 three-pointers, while dishing out 12 assists and playing suffocating defense that frustrated the college team's point guard into turnover after turnover. What shocked Marcus most was not just that the street players won, but how they won. They played with a creativity and joy that the more formally trained college players lacked. Every possession was an opportunity for innovation, for trying something unexpected, for making the crowd gasp and cheer. The college players, despite their training and physical advantages, looked rigid and predictable by comparison, running set plays that the street ballers read and disrupted effortlessly. It was like watching jazz musicians outperform classical players in a freestyle competition. The formally trained players bound by structure, while the street players improvised with confidence, born from thousands of hours of unstructured play. After the game, Marcus sat on the curb outside the court, reviewing the footage on his camera and reconsidering everything he thought he knew about talent evaluation. His 15 years of experience had taught him to look for specific markers: size, athleticism, formal training, structured competition. But those markers had been developed in American basketball culture and might not apply universally. What if the best pure basketball skills, the handles, the vision, the creativity, actually developed better in unstructured environments where players had to improvise constantly? What if formal training sometimes inhibited the kind of instinctive playmaking he had just witnessed? Marcus spent 2 more weeks in the Philippines, visiting street courts across Manila and in provincial areas. He watched hundreds of games, talked to dozens of players, and documented talent that no one in the international scouting community knew existed. He saw players who could shoot from impossible angles on crooked rims, who had developed handles on uneven surfaces that made them nearly impossible to defend on proper courts, who understood team basketball at an intuitive level that many professionally trained players never achieved. He also confronted his own biases. He had laughed initially because these players did not fit his mental model of what basketball talent looked like. They were too short, too poor, playing in conditions too rough to produce real skills. But that laughter had been born from ignorance and cultural assumptions, not from actual evaluation of their abilities. The Filipino street players had developed their skills under constraints that would have broken most American players, and those constraints had forged abilities that formal training often failed to create. Marcus returned to Los Angeles with footage, notes, and contacts for over 30 Filipino street players he believed had professional potential. He presented his findings to his agency with a recommendation that they establish a development program specifically designed to give Filipino street players access to professional opportunities. He acknowledged in his presentation that he had initially dismissed these players based on physical measurements and playing conditions, and that he had been completely wrong. The agency was skeptical, but intrigued enough to fund a pilot program.
6 months later, Thirdy and 5 other Filipino street players were training in a development facility in Los Angeles, preparing for opportunities in international professional leagues. Thirdy adapted quickly to formal training, his street skills translating perfectly to structured play, his basketball IQ allowing him to grasp complex offensive and defensive concepts faster than many players who had been formally coached their entire lives. Within a year, he signed with a professional team in Southeast Asia, and 2 years after Marcus first saw him on that cracked asphalt court in Tondo, Thirdy was competing against former NBA players in a regional league, more than holding his own. Marcus's experience in the Philippines changed how he approached talent evaluation. He became an advocate for scouts looking beyond traditional markers, for recognizing that basketball genius could develop anywhere, and for understanding that passion and thousands of hours of practice could overcome almost any disadvantage in resources or formal training. He wrote articles about Filipino street basketball, gave presentations at scouting conferences, and pushed his industry to reconsider assumptions about where talent could be found. The story went viral when Marcus posted the original footage of that street court game, with Thirdy's fearless play and the contrast between street ballers and college players capturing attention across social media. Basketball fans debated whether formal training or street experience produced better skills, whether American scouting had been overlooking entire populations of talent, whether the future of basketball might come from unexpected places. The video reached millions of views, inspired other scouts to explore overlooked basketball communities, and gave hope to street players around the world that their skills might be recognized. For Thirdy and the other Filipino street players Marcus helped, the impact was profound. They had gone from playing for the love of the game on neighborhood courts to competing professionally, earning money doing what they loved, representing their communities on international stages. But perhaps more importantly, they proved that talent, determination, and thousands of hours of practice mattered more than perfect facilities, expensive coaching, or ideal physical measurements. They showed that basketball genius could bloom anywhere, even on cracked asphalt in Manila's poorest neighborhoods, and that scouts willing to look beyond their assumptions might find extraordinary ability in the most unexpected places.